Well, good afternoon. My name is John Kenyon, and I'm the Executive Director of the Iowa City UNESCO City of Literature organization. I would like to welcome you to the 2020 Iowa City Book Festival. We've had some wonderful events this week, so if you've missed anything so far, you can visit iowacitybookfestival.org for information and links that will allow you to catch up by watching recordings of past events. These include sessions with James Autry, Thomas Frank, Jill McCorkle, Ron Rash, and Erica Billerbeck. This year's festival is made possible because of support from the City of Iowa City, the University of Iowa, the Iowa Arts Council, and Iowa Public Radio. Today's event is with Charles Connerly, a professor and director of the University of Iowa School of Urban and Regional Planning, who will discuss his new book from the University of Iowa Press, Green, Fair, and Prosperous: Paths to a Sustainable Iowa. If you have questions at any time during today's program, you can click Ask a Question below the video and submit one. If you're on a device, there is an icon with a question mark in it that will take you to that spot. If you're interested in buying a copy of the book, you can click Buy the Book/Donate, which is a green button below the video, which will take you to a page with a link to buy the book from our friends at Prairie Lights. In addition, you can learn about how to support the City of Literature, which helps us to continue to offer free programming like the Iowa City Book Festival. And now I would like to welcome Charles Connerly.
Very good. Hi. Hello, I'm Chuck Connerly, and I'm pleased to be here to read from my book, Green, Fair, and Prosperous. I want to display the cover of the book. You would have seen it when you signed in. This is a University of Iowa Press book, and the cover was designed by Claudia McGehee, who I think is on the line. Wonderful picture of a starry night, I think, maybe, and a pig that's looking up at the sky. So I think that's really a cool picture. So anyhow, the name of the book is Green, Fair, and Prosperous: Paths to a Sustainable Iowa, and it really attempts to look at what we call the three E's of sustainability. Environmental sustainability is usually what people think about when they think of sustainability, but also economic sustainability, that is economic growth. And in particular, I look at the growth of the middle class, the opportunities for people to be in the middle class and to stay and remain in the middle class in Iowa, and how that's changed over time. And then lastly, the other E is equity, for ethnic diversity and equality in the state of Iowa. It's my belief that we are at a crossroads moment in Iowa where each of these three E's is in a situation where we could go in one direction or another. We could become a polluted or more polluted, racially divided state with growing income inequality, or as the title suggests, we can become green, fair, and prosperous. This is both an historical and a contemporary analysis. My background, in addition to urban and regional planning, is also history. And so I look at the history of Iowa as well as the contemporary situation. I'm going to read three sections of the book. I'm going to read from Chapter 1. The title of Chapter 1 is Agriculture, Manufacturing, and Iowa's Middle Class. And in that, I look at the history of the state's agro-industrial sector, and that is agriculture and manufacturing. And in the last section, I look at three communities, micropolitan communities, that is communities between 10,000 and 50,000, and how they fared over the last 40 or 50 years, particularly with regard to the manufacturing sector in those communities, how that's declined and how that's had an impact on the middle class in those communities. The second segment of the reading, or section of the reading, I'm going to read from Chapter 4, which has the title, Why is Iowa So White? And I'm going to read the beginning of that chapter where I talk about sort of my impressions of Iowa and how I get to the actual topic of that's suggested by the question. And lastly, in the third segment, I'm going to read from the concluding chapter of the book about recommendations. The final chapter is recommendations, but I'm going to talk about specifically the recommendations with regard to environmental sustainability, particularly with regard to water quality. So the idea is that the three sections that I'm reading, deal with the three E's: economic development, social equity, and the environment. So let's get started. This again is the conclusion actually to chapter 1, whose title is Agriculture, Manufacturing, and Iowa's Middle Class. And I'm talking about several towns in Iowa. And so this paragraph begins, another Mississippi River town, Clinton, was also once home to a major railroad shop, the Chicago and Northwestern. As in Burlington, many people from Clinton worked in the C&NW yards, which employed as many as 1,500 Clinton residents. As in Burlington as well, as railroads consolidated operations, the C&NW yards closed in 1995. Other major industrial employers that have left the city include Central Steel Tube and DuPont, which manufactured cellophane in Clinton before selling its plant in 2002. At one time, DuPont employed nearly 1,400 people. Between 1980 and 2016, as these businesses left, Clinton lost close to 22% of its population. During that time, Clinton not only lost people, but its workers also lost a major source of leverage for maintaining good jobs at good wages. In 1979 and 1980, Clinton underwent a major strike in which 750 members of Local 6 of the American Federation of Grain Millers struck Clinton Corn Processing, now known as Archer Daniels Midland, or ADM. Local 6 was a strong union that over the years had gained good pay and good benefits for its members. Local contracts were imitated by Clinton's DuPont plant as well. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the union had used 3 strikes to obtain 5 favorable contracts. By the mid-1970s, high fructose corn syrup prices had dropped significantly. At the same time, new corporate management looked to reduce costs and squeeze profits from low-profit subsidiaries, and therefore brought a new approach to the table that presaged the national decline in labor unions in the 1980s. Clinton Corn began to propagandize against the union, which was followed by a management union skirmish and a wildcat strike over the discharge of a worker who had a company light bulb in his lunchbox. In 1979, Clinton Corn hired strikebreakers and eventually broke the union when a decertification vote succeeded in 1980. In addition to ending union representation in one of Clinton's leading industries, the 8-month strike divided the community, which further eroded the union's position. The strike is very similar to if you have ever seen the documentary about the Hormel strike in Austin, Minnesota, which divided that community. Newton is the newest micropolitan city in Iowa to succumb to the loss of a major employer. Newton was the home of the Maytag washing machine company for nearly 100 years. For nearly 100 years, the firm employed thousands of white and blue-collar workers to guide the company and manufacture its products. After it was purchased by Whirlpool in 2006, its new owner found the United Auto Workers organized operation redundant with existing non-union plants in Ohio and Mexico. Instead of earning $20 per hour with good benefits, laid-off production workers faced the prospect of jobs in central Iowa paying little more than half that amount. Maytag's name recognition led to national coverage, including an August 2007 New York Times article under the apt title, Is there middle class life after Maytag? The answer to this question came in the years following. From 2001 through 2005, prior to Maytag's closure in 2007, manufacturing workers in Newton's Jasper County earned a total compensation of about 1/3 more annually than other manufacturing workers across the state. From 2010 through 2016, Jasper County manufacturing workers earn only 73 to 83% of what manufacturing workers statewide earned. Over this period, manufacturing jobs in the county dropped from 4,556 in 2001 to 1,483 in 2008, before climbing back to 2,399 in 2016 for an overall decline in manufacturing jobs of nearly 50%. Newton has lost 1.7% of its population since 1980, most of that since 2010. Events in Mason City provide a perfect example of the challenges facing Iowa's micropolitan towns. Mason City has been steadily losing population since 1970, and Cerro Gordo County lost 35% of its manufacturing jobs between 2000 and 2015. In 2016, given the option of adding 2,000 non-union jobs through a proposed Prestige Foods pork processing plant, with the assistance of $15 million in state incentives, matched with over $11 million in local incentives, citizens faced a difficult dilemma. Some could reflect on the 1975 closing of the 1,300 employee J.E. Decker meat processing plant that had once anchored the city's industrial base. However, they could also see that the new plant would not offer the same income that Decker had offered 4 decades earlier. Prestige's $13 per hour was below the local average, and many immigrants from other countries were expected to fill the new positions. Citizens also expressed concerns about the effect of the hog plant's job growth on the community, especially at schools. The introduction of many non-English speaking children would certainly challenge local schools. Some suggested that opposition to the plant stemmed from resistance to the likely addition of a number of Hispanic Americans or other ethnic groups into this predominantly white community. Residents were also concerned about the possible effect of the new plant on the environment. They questioned whether such a large plant would entice more concentrated animal feeding operations, CAFOs, to locate in or near Mason City to take advantage of what would be the area's proximity to a major consumer of hogs. Residents and businesses in nearby Clear Lake worried about the impact that these confinement operations would have on the attractiveness of Clear Lake's namesake amenity, which attracts tourists and affluent people with expensive homes near the lake. Overhanging the debate was the question, whether fully articulated or not, if not this, then what? Although Mason City continues to play a role as a medical and retail center for north central Iowa, work opportunities in these areas have not been enough to compensate for the loss of industrial employment. Mason City is not like Des Moines, where insurance and financial services help drive the economy and population, or for that matter, even like Cedar Rapids, where traditional agro-industrial employers, such as Quaker Oats, have been complemented by major aerospace employer Collins Aerospace. After much debate and an unlikely partnership between liberal and conservative groups, in early May 2016, the Mason City Council voted in a tie not to provide financial incentives to the project, and Prestige found a more receptive community in Eagle Grove, about 70 miles southwest of Mason City. Going forward, Mason City is confronted with major questions about what kind of community it wants to be. Historically, it has been a manufacturing community, but these jobs are drying up, and the types of blue-collar employment that many Iowa communities can attract often include meatpacking. Like much of Iowa, Mason City remains tied to the agro-industrial economy. As those jobs shrink in number and lose their union benefits, and as family farms become fewer and bigger, the question looms large. What will become of Iowa's economy and its middle class? And without well-paying jobs in manufacturing, as well as opportunities on the farm, how will Iowa mitigate the growing income inequality that characterizes the state? Okay, that's the end of chapter 1. Now I'm going to move to chapter 4. Again, the title of this chapter is Why is Iowa So White? And here I begin with a personal reflection. In the spring of 2011, I traveled with a group of University of Iowa faculty and staff to the central and northern parts of the states as members of the Faculty Engagement Corps. The Corps' purpose was to introduce faculty and staff to parts of the state they might not otherwise visit. We stopped in medium-sized towns like Webster City and Marshalltown, small towns like Goodell, and the state's largest city, its capital, Des Moines. In Marshalltown, we met with school officials to discuss the challenges posed by the city's growing number of Hispanic American children, many of whose parents had immigrated to the area to work in the Swift pork processing plant. Everyone we met with on the 3-day tour was white. And even when driving through Des Moines, where we visited the art museum and talked with state natural resources and education officials, as well as business lobbyists, we saw no people of color. It is quite possible that the faculty and staff on our tour would not even have noticed that we met with no people of color, except that one of our colleagues, who is African American, commented on this after the trip was over. In response, planners for the next year's trip scheduled a visit to Waterloo, home to one of the state's largest African American populations. Such is diversity in Iowa. You can drive through the state or walk through the University of Iowa campus, as I have, and not see a single African American or Latin American person. And unless you're a member of those groups, you may not think anything of it. In 2017, Iowa was the nation's 6th whitest state, trailing Maine, Montana, New Hampshire, Vermont, and West Virginia, with 85.9% of its residents white. White being defined as not African American, Native American, Hispanic American, or Asian American. If we define Iowa's history as beginning with statehood in 1846, then Iowa's history seems to be the story of white people. In 1850, whites comprised 99.8% of the new state's population. The state's white share of the population would not dip below 99% until 1970. From that year forward, the number and percentage of non-whites in Iowa would begin to grow, but not so fast as to challenge Iowa's position as one of the whitest states in the nation. Between 1980 and 2015, the number of African Americans grew more than 2.5 times, from 41,700 to 110,050. Over the same period, Asian Americans increased sixfold, from 11,577 to 73,564. The state's small population of Native Americans nearly tripled, from 5,455 to 15,924. Most dramatically, from 1980 through 2015, the number of Hispanic Americans grew from 25,536 to 182,606, a 7-fold increase, and Hispanics became the largest minority population in the state. By 2018, the state's Hispanic American population had grown to 194,432. In 2017, the African American, Asian American, and Native American population in Iowa were 120,218, 82,346, and 16,222. Despite rapid growth from small numbers, much of Iowa continues to look white. This is because Iowa's African American, Native American, Asian American, and Hispanic American populations are concentrated in relatively few places. In 2016, 60% of the state's African American population lived in only 4 counties: Black Hawk, Lynn, Polk, and Scott. Reflecting the rapid growth of Iowa's Hispanic American population, 23 of Iowa's 99 counties are 5% or more Hispanic. Of these, 11 are more than 10% Hispanic, with Crawford, Buena Vista, Marshall, Muscatine, and Louisa leading the state. Each of these counties has at least one major meat packing plant. Nearly 46% of the state's Hispanic population lives in Polk, Woodbury, Scott, Marshall, and Johnson counties. But 3/4 of the state's counties have Hispanic populations of less than 5% of the total county population. In 2016, 38% of the state's Native American population lived in just 3 counties: Woodbury, Polk, and Tama. Finally, in 2015, 63% of Asian Americans lived in 5 counties: Polk, Johnson, Story, Lynn, and Scott. Iowa's whiteness, however, belies its history, both before and after statehood. As with its environmental and economic issues, Iowa is at a crossroads regarding diversity. State forecasts project that the percentage of the population that is white will decline from 91% in 2010 to 76% in 2050, with at least a doubling in the number of African Americans, Asian Americans, and Hispanic Americans. How did Iowa become predominantly white? How was it able to remain white for so long? Going forward, how well is it handling the process of moving from a predominantly white to a more diverse population? And how can the state positively address its growing heterogeneity and become more sustainable, not only in an environmental and economic sense, but also with regard to social justice? That's the key question. And just briefly, one more paragraph in this section. So how did Iowa become so white? The quick answer, of course, is that Euro-American settlers, eager for new land in a nation that added population at an astounding rate of roughly 33% every decade between 1790 and 1860, took it from Native Americans. Native Americans had lived in what is now Iowa for millennia. At least 14 Indian nations are identified as having lived in the state: Iowa, Ottawa, and Missouri, Omaha and Ponca, Pawnee and Arikara, Santee and Yankton Sioux, Sauk, Mesquachi, Potawatomi, Winnebago, Illinois, Huron, Mascouten, Ojibwa, and Miami. And the rest of the chapter goes on to describe how Iowa was made white as a part of state and federal policy. And the last section, and how much we got? Do we have time for another reading? But we're into 20 minutes. What do you think, John?
I think you're good.
Okay. All right. Okay, this is from the last chapter. The last chapter, by the way, is titled "The Best State in America?" ? Which is based on a survey that was done by U.S. News that claimed that Iowa was the best state in 2018. And so in this chapter, I talk a little bit about water quality. Iowa should take its critical role in water quality more seriously. When it comes to water quality, Iowa is clearly in the driver's seat. The state's farming operations are among the most intense users of fertilizers in the Mississippi River Basin. This has clear implications for Iowa's waters. Iowa accounts for more than its share of nutrient pollution flowing to the Gulf of Mexico. As noted earlier, the most recent estimate is 29% of the nutrients flowing from the 12 states that comprise the Mississippi River Gulf of Mexico Watershed Nutrient Task Force, otherwise known as the Hypoxia Task Force. So Iowa accounts for 29% of those 12 states. Iowa's elected secretaries, agriculture secretaries, Bill Northey and more recently Mike Naig, have served as state co-chairs, along with the federal co-chair, of the Hypoxia Task Force since 2010. Appointed Undersecretary of Agriculture in 2018, Northey continues to serve on the Hypoxia Task Force as the U.S. Department of Agriculture representative. Iowa has therefore been a major contributor to nutrient pollution in Iowa, Mississippi, and Gulf waters, while being in a position to influence state and federal policy regarding nutrient contamination, nitrates specifically, as well as potassium or phosphorus, Given Iowa's influence, both environmental and political, on water quality in the state, region, and nation, its record has been weak. The Environmental Protection Agency and the Hypoxia Task Force have failed to move decisively against the causes of Gulf hypoxia, so-called dead zone, in the Gulf of Mexico. Iowa's leadership position on the Hypoxia Task Force has undoubtedly influenced this outcome. Within the state, efforts to reduce nutrients in its waterways have been ineffectual. Since the beginning of the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategies Water Quality Initiative in 2013 through fiscal year 2018, the Iowa legislature has budgeted nearly $55 million for an annual average of $9 million. Since 2012, overall annual state funding for water quality has averaged $41 million, lower than 10 years earlier from 2007 through 2009. These amounts stand in contrast to the minimum of $77 million annually, estimated to meet the goals of the nutrient reduction strategy. The state's pathetic response to its water quality challenges is reflected in the state's March 2019 annual report on the strategy. The report estimates that there are 25 bioreactors in the state, treating nutrients that would otherwise flow directly through drain tiles into Iowa waterways. With each bioreactor servicing approximately 50 acres, as many as 138,000 bioreactors are needed to meet the scenarios laid out in the strategy. The March 2019 report also estimates that 760,000 acres were planted in cover crops in 2017, representing only 3.3% of Iowa's 23,300,000 acres planted in corn and soybeans that year. With With such findings as these, the report has no choice but to conclude that early efforts only scratch the surface of what is needed across the state to meet the non-point source nutrient reduction. Progress has occurred, but not at the scale that would impact statewide water quality measures. Statewide improvements affected by conservation practices will require a much greater degree of implementation that has occurred so far. And I'm going to stop here. The next part of the reading, which it takes another 2 pages, talks about the need for subsidies, because farmers basically aren't going to volunteer to do the practices that will cost them money, that will result in a reduction of nutrients flowing into our rivers and eventually the Gulf of Mexico. But also, in addition to subsidies, in the spirit of Aldo Leopold, who felt like we needed to have really more, he really wanted a land ethic, is what he called it, or a conservation ethic. And part of that is going to be expectations or regulations even about performance in terms of what is expected of farmers. So I'm not going to go into more detail than that. But so I'm going to stop right now, and I'm going to direct this to Dave Osterberg. Dave is a retired faculty member, professor emeritus of public health here at the University of Iowa, former member of the State House of Representatives, and he is a co-founder of the Iowa Policy Project, a very important organization that provided a lot of the research that I quote or cite in the book.
Well, thanks, Chuck. I assume you can hear me?
Yes, I can.
And maybe everybody else can too. Let's hope. Well, I'm happy to be the moderator here, and please ask questions. Please put them into the ask a question box, long, short, whatever you like, and I will pass them on. That's my job. And but I want to start with a couple of questions of my own. I got to read Chuck's book back in December when it was being created, and was able to make some comments on it then. And the first thing is, I mean, I've lived here for 45 years. During much of the time that Chuck's writing about, I did not recognize a whole bunch of things that I found in this book that I just never knew, because I didn't know the back history before what I understood to be questions about Iowa's economy. But one question I found really fascinating, and that was the story of the Mesquachi. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because I think most of us know there's the Mesquachi Nation. How did they get here when we did our best back in the 1840s to throw all Native Americans out of the state because the land was so good?
Right, and they were pretty much to be eliminated from the state of Iowa and to move to Kansas. They, in the 1840s, there were a series of treaties that just basically moved them out of eastern Iowa, out of Dubuque, where they had mine lead, and kept moving them westward. So by about 1845 or so, they were supposed to be entirely out of the state. Well, some never left, and others came back, and they were persistent. And so over a period of about 10 years, and I don't have the date in front of me, it's in the book, they finally, they were able to appeal to some legislators, as well as the Governor Grimes of the state of Iowa. And one of the legislators, I'm going to put a plug in for J.B. Grinnell, founder of the town of Grinnell, where I went to college, was also one of their advocates. And it seems odd, but they had to get permission to buy land as Native Americans, even though they were the original residents, they had no rights basically. And so the Iowa legislature passed legislation to permit them to buy 80 acres of land on the Iowa River. They wanted to be on the river. Part of their way of life was being near the river, obviously for fishing. So the legislature approved that. And so they were able to buy that land, and it grew from 80 acres to what is now 8,000 acres, and is now, I believe, they have the largest single employer in Tama County with the casino there. So they've been very successful. There still remain issues in between in the community, but they are an important part of Iowa. And Jonathan Buffalo, who is their historian, talks about the fact that at the same time that Iowa permitted them to come back to the state, and you say, well, how magnanimous is that, But compared to California, which he cites, which was trying to eliminate all Native Americans from California, Iowa was at least somewhat progressive. And of course, Grimes was an abolitionist as well. So this was the birth of the Republican Party. This was a time in which there was a modicum of progressive thinking in the state of Iowa.
And it's really interesting to read in your book how here are the Republicans who are the progressives and the Democrats who are just pretty awful on race relations. And
they are pretty awful.
Yeah. There's a question up, and I'd like to pass that on to you, Chuck. And something just disappeared, and I don't know why that happened. Dear me. Jonathan, maybe you have to do something.
If you just click the ask a question, it should pop back up.
Okay, well, I did that and it took me out, completely out. You want to ask that question while I try to get back in?
Sure, I can do that. So the question is, Mr. Connerly, I applaud your efforts to document the environmental crisis in Iowa, but it raises the obvious question: how can the average person do anything against all the agribusiness damages like crop pesticide and CFO runoff? Basically, governmental officials are unwilling to do anything against the status quo of monoculture, and in fact, there's a very cozy relationship. So there's your question for you.
Gee, David might be in a better position to answer this question than I do. There's just incredible power in that sector, in the ag sector of the state of Iowa. The book talks about the Des Moines Waterworks suit of 2015, where they sued three counties. Actually, they're suing the drainage districts in those three counties in north central Iowa, and all the backers of all the big ag interests fairly surreptitiously raised money to defend these three counties, the county commissioners, the county supervisors. It's still not clear where that money came from. It was really, really dark money. This is where our friend Art Cullen won a Pulitzer Prize for trying to investigate to find out who it was that was giving that money to support the high legal costs, the high legal fees. I don't think he ever found out who was behind it, but it's clear when whether it's the Farm Bureau or the other the major seed companies or the big packing companies, they have a lot of power. So you're absolutely right. But it really begins with the election and begins with trying to turn politics around in this state, so that there is at least some countervailing power from the people who were affected by these policies. One of the things that I talk about in the book is the fact that local governments have no say over the siting of CAFOs, the confined animal feeding operations. That power was taken away about 20 years ago. It means that we are at the beck and whim or of the beck and call, I guess I should say, of whatever the these hog producers want us to do. And the same was true with what happened to Mason City and what I was describing. I mean, they were basically told by the state, here's your deal. You're going to have a hog. If you want economic development, this is what it's going to look like. And if you don't want it, then we're going to just forget about it. We're not going, we'll go somewhere else where they want it more than you do. It is a challenge. I begin with in the recommendations talking about we need to begin to restore some of the things that we lost, like in 2017, the rights of public workers to really seriously unionize and to press for higher wages, and we need to press for other working folk to do the same thing as well. That was historically the countervailing power in this country, were the labor unions, certainly in the meatpacking industry. Look what happened this summer or this spring when all of the meatpacking plants went through the COVID crisis. You heard a little bit about what unions were saying, but they didn't have really any power to do anything about it. And all the attention was on the farmers and on the meatpacking companies, and the workers were basically forgotten about. And they were basically told they had to go back to work. So yeah, it's daunting. It's really daunting. But this is a democracy. Sorry, Dave, go ahead.
Just one, right. And Farm Bureau is beyond the pale, but there's at least one mainly farm organization that has taken a positive step, and that is in fact, in the back of your ballot right now is the election for the Soil and Water District Commissioners. And those commissioners in my county, Lynn County, voted to mandate there be a 50-foot buffer along all streams in the state of Iowa. And mandate, I mean, this is regulation. They took it to the big meeting of all those people. There are 500 of them get together every year. Every county, 99 counties times 5, plus one county has 2. And they turned it down. The second year, they approved it. So that mostly farmers are on these soil and water districts, especially in the small counties. And yet they voted to say, water quality is just awful in the state. We have to do something about it. So at least they came up with a 35-foot buffer, the organization did, along all streams. That's something. So there are farmers out there who are progressive, but unfortunately, the big group is not. Yeah,
and Minnesota has had good success with that policy, and it's basically been the requirements have been met by something like 99% of farmers. So yeah. It can work, and it's certainly effective.
It is effective. So another question has come up, and Chuck, would you compare and contrast the incomes of people of color versus white households in the state, particularly white family farm households? I'm not sure there are a lot of non-white. What percentage of people of color households own farms? So that's a question.
Okay. I looked at this, it's not in the book, but somebody asked me about that. And so I looked at the 2017 Census of Agriculture, and there are only 2 counties in the state of Iowa that have any black farmers. And I think their number is certainly less than 10. One was in Eastern. I'm blanking on this because I didn't look to see what the names of the counties were, and I don't know my map that well. But one was in Eastern Iowa, and one was in just west of Des Moines. So it was probably what is that, Dallas County? I'm guessing it's Dallas County, and I think the other one was either Muscatine or Louisa County. But those are the only 2 counties that have any black farmers. And so I don't know how their incomes. I just don't know how their incomes compare. They probably don't even report the data because there are so few.
Mm-hmm. And the rest of the question was about incomes in general.
I should have that number in front of me. Basically nationally, black incomes are on average, less than white incomes. The big discrepancy is in the form of wealth. In the form of wealth, it's nationally, it's like black wealth is like 8%, 8 or 9% of white wealth. And the percent of income, I don't want to even throw a number out there. It's higher than it used to be, I believe, but it's still not equal. And we're in Iowa, in the last section, I just mentioned it, like the next to last paragraph, but Colin Gordon's piece that he wrote last fall for not only the Iowa Policy Project, where his focus is on the Midwest, but he looks at how in all these categories, whether, comparing black and white, home ownership rates, income, poverty rates, education, et cetera, the Midwest, not surprising after what we witnessed in both Kenosha and Minneapolis, fares less well than the rest of the nation. And Iowa is, well, I'll even read it. I think I can go right to it. Hang on just a minute. For 8th grade math scores, for example, Iowa's white to black ratio is 17th from the bottom. For out of school suspensions, Iowa's white to black ratio is 6th from last. For the share of individuals over age 25 who have a college degree, Iowa's white to black ratio is 22nd from last. For prime age adults, a much higher percentage of whites are employed than African Americans. The 2017 white to black ratio between the two groups places Iowa second from the bottom. That was employment ratio. Is that right? I just said, yeah. If we compare rates of unemployment, Iowa's ratio of white to black unemployment is 7th from the bottom. When we compare the white to black ratio of home ownership, Iowa is also 7th from the bottom. Iowa's ratio of white to black median income, this is what you're talking about, is 6th from the bottom. Its ratio of white to black poverty is 5th from the bottom. The state's ratio of white to black infant mortality is 11th from the bottom. And as most of us know, Iowa's ratio of white to black incarceration is 3rd from the bottom. So it's Iowa doesn't do very well with regard to race and outcomes.
And Chuck, this came into the chat when you were reading, and when you were reading about going around the state and the officials you met with. And the question is identifying a big problem that even when you have a population, people aren't represented in relation to their population. You just didn't find very many supervisors, business.
Oh, yeah. And it's, when you look at, we now have 2 African-American mayors in the state, Waterloo and Iowa City. But that's noticeable because there had been basically none, as far as I know. I'm not aware that there were any before. There were, a few black legislators, but there aren't very many. In terms of people, whether you talk obviously governor or lieutenant governor and other positions like that, you see very few at all. So it's easy to believe that you're in a predominantly white state, even though the proportion of African Americans is growing. One of the things I didn't read, but I talk about is, when you look at population growth, this state has forever been, or at least since 1900, has been very conscious of the fact that it's losing ground compared to other states. From 1900 to 2000, the 100 years, in 1900, Iowa was the 10th largest state in the nation. That's hard to believe. The 10th largest state. By the year 2000, it was the 30th largest state. And I think right now we're 31. So we're sort of leveling off a little bit. Why are we leveling off? Because of the groups that I named in that chapter. African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, and to even a smaller degree, Native Americans. Whites, the growth in the white population in the state of Iowa is very, very small. So if you want to really encourage people to come to Iowa and welcome them here and make them feel welcome and encourage them to stay and encourage them to continue to add and contribute to the economy, then it's necessary to make people make people, like I just discussed, more comfortable. Help them go to college, help them go to the university. If you can't help if you can't help the parent, then help the child at least by providing good education, paying those teachers really well in those schools. Those are all important things. So we need to be doing a better job of nurturing the people that are coming to Iowa, because they may just want to stay.
Another question, and I love it, the unacknowledged elephant in the room. And it's literally because how would the leaders of the contemporary Republican Party in Iowa respond to your arguments, Chuck? And how would you reply?
Well, I see who wrote that question too. That's a good question, how they would respond. I'm not even certain they would be interested even in having the conversation. I mean, they frankly, this is sounding terribly political, but I'm not sure they really are interested in even having that conversation or having that debate. I think they would talk about what they would view as being fair and equal treatment of minority groups in the state of Iowa. But going back again to the COVID crisis in the meatpacking plants, the people that were, and I'm not going to say the governor, but the people who were in charge of the government were not talking about, they were talking about farmers who had pigs that were getting too fat, and they were talking about meatpacking companies, and they were talking about the price of meat, but they were not talking about the Hispanic or the Congolese or the Burmese employees that work in many of these meatpacking plants. And it's only when we, frankly, on the other side, come together and organize and that we can begin to overtake this. I don't want to get political, but listen, I heard J.D. Scholten talk. J.D. Scholten is a populist. And, populism has been given a bad name because of the guy in the White House. But there have also been multiracial populist movements. And I really think it's something that we need again.
I think I'd like to get to the solutions, but maybe a last question that I found really amazing. If you looked at Iowa in 1975, you would find lots of people employed at John Deere and International Harvester and Case, and you'd find all kinds of people at High Grade and Swift and those kind of companies making very, very good wages. And then by 10 years later, it's all gone.
Right.
So fast that came about. And that's in your first chapter. I found that just fascinating. Can you just...
Yeah. I mean, the meatpacking industry changes radically beginning really in the 1960s. The founding of IBP, Iowa Beef Packers, in the early 1960s. And they basically practiced the de-skilling of meat processing. And part of that was enabled by some technological changes that they were able to take advantage of. But they wanted to speed up the line, and they basically wanted to kill the unions, because you're right, the many of the middle class jobs in these towns of between 10 and 50,000 or even larger, like Rath in Waterloo. These were jobs that people wanted to get. The civil rights movement in Waterloo was partly about the union trying to get equal opportunity for African American workers to work at Rath Packing, where they could make good income. But these startup companies like IBP began to compete with the more traditional companies, and basically were able to outbid, would be able to produce meat at a lower cost. And the emphasis in this country, as Earl Butz talked about in the documentary King Corn, he at the end of his life says, really, the whole thing is about cheap food. And that, for centuries, the price of food has been a big issue. And the way you keep the masses quiet is by having cheap food. And so these companies like IBP figured out how to do that with speeding up the line, with technological improvements, and with bringing in labor who would work for less money, particularly after they busted the unions. And so, again, the movie that I mentioned, whose name Barbara Koppel directed the film, came out in the late 1980s, won an Academy Award, and about the Hormel strike in Austin, Minnesota. And the same thing, and of course, Hormel was in Ottumwa as well. And so Ottumwa gets caught up in that. And a lot of people get fired from the labor union. So whether it's Perry or Storm Lake or these other communities, the unions get busted. Yeah, American Dream was the name of the film. Thank you very much. The unions get busted, and then they bring in initially Latin American workers, many from Texas and California, some from south of the border, and they pay them less, and they work very hard to keep the unions from ever returning to those companies. And it's part of the reason why, I should be careful what I say, but the Burmese have been recruited to work in Tyson's, for example. Why does Tyson's like Burmese? Well, they're legal, they're refugees. Secondly, their language skills are not that good. They haven't learned English necessarily yet. So being able to organize the Burmese and Hispanic workers and Congolese, all of whom are speaking different languages, it's very, 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 very difficult to do. So that whole process of transformation of meatpacking industry, speeding up the line, basically changed the business. There was a story in the New York Times a couple of years ago. They interviewed somebody who was working in Storm Lake. He had been working at the same meatpacking company since 1979 or 1980. He was about to retire some 40 years later. He was making the same salary in 2018 as he was making in 1980, same hourly salary. And he says, and the guy he's quoted in the article, and he says, in 1980, with my salary, a guy could buy, in this case, he was saying a guy could buy a house and a boat. And, and that's middle-class living. That's just not there anymore.
Yeah, I'm looking for new questions, but one of the things that diversity, I think, has brought, when I was at the university, I did some work in Columbus Junction, a town, business district transformed by mainly Hispanic businesses, where you had a bunch of boarded up downtown, and it certainly seemed to be thriving when I was doing work there.
We had we've been in Columbus Junction the last 2 years with the Iowa Initiative for Sustainable Communities. And we made, working with students, we made some short documentary films. First year was with the Hispanic community. The second year was with the Burmese community. We're still working on the Burmese films because we got disrupted by COVID this past spring. But in particularly interviewing young people, high school age people in Columbus Junction, they love that community. They love the sense of belonging that they have there. And they many of them face a real dilemma the ones that want to go to college, because they really know that they have to leave Columbus Junction in order to get a college education, but they don't want to leave that community permanently. These are the people that we need to nurture and help them stay. That is an established community. They have ties to that place. They like Iowa and they want to stay. And how can we help these talented people remain in Iowa and maybe hopefully in or near Columbus Junction?
You know, and I think that's maybe a good thing to end with. I was going to have you talk about your 10 points that the state, but people can read that. They're very good. I agree with every one of them. But we're coming up at close to the end of this, Chuck. Maybe you should figure out a 2-minute close. A
2-minute close. Yeah. Well, I know some people have already voted, but you know, it's not. It is technically the election is 3 weeks away. But the issues that are covered in the book, whether they be climate change or they be water quality, issues of labor unions in the state of Iowa, the declining middle class in the state of Iowa, and issues of racial justice. We should be talking to our legislators about it. We should be trying to get their attention. And of course, even after the election, we still need to do that. We need to hold them accountable for this. I think really there is a sense of a lack of accountability on these issues by the Iowa legislature and by the governor. And you know, you know, it's not in the book, but of course, because the book was written before COVID crisis. But reading the editorial in today's Des Moines Register about basically the Reynolds administration's refusal to give information even about the COVID crisis, particularly with regard to schools, and that it takes a private citizen living in Ames, working with the teachers unions, who are getting the data out, because the teachers know what's going on, even if the administrations at those schools don't want to talk about it, and the governor doesn't want them to talk about it, or doesn't at least require them to talk about it. So it's this stonewalling. We've got into a period of stonewalling. Somebody mentioned Trump's doctrine. We've got to call this out. This is unacceptable. If people can just simply get by with giving us bad information or no information, then we're in trouble.
Great. And I think, let me say, having read an early draft and the book, this is a great book. And it's right up until January of 2020, with the governor trying to raise sales taxes and cut income taxes and not fund water quality very well.
Right.
A great thing to read. And it especially gives you that history to make you understand Iowa. Even though you thought you understood it, Chuck's helped to make all of us better at that. And we are right at the time we were supposed to have. And so, unless there's another question, and here, thank you, Jack.
Right on time. Well, I just wanted to take a moment to thank Charles Connerly and David Osterberg for a wonderful discussion. And thanks to everyone who submitted questions. It was a great, lively hour. It went quickly. So again, Chuck's book is Green, Fair, and Prosperous. It is available from the University of Iowa Press. And again, if you click the buy the book /donate button at the bottom, it will take you to a page that would give you a link to purchase that book from Prairie Lights if you haven't done so already. So again, thanks to you two gentlemen. We have plenty more to come in the Iowa City Book Festival, and you can check that out at iowacitybbookfestival.org. Thanks for joining us today, and have a good rest of your Sunday.
Thanks, David. Thanks, John.
Thank you.